Greg Collins, Marvin Monroe, and Darren Mills were ordinary Texas husbands until they discovered they were all being deceived by the same man, Pastor Charles Hemsworth. Respected by the town, worshipped by his congregation, and trusted by their wives, Charles wasn't just leading sermons, he was leading a secret life of betrayal that would ignite a violent storm. At 52, he had a calming voice, kind eyes, and the gentle manner of someone who had devoted his life to God for nearly 2 decades. He led the Oak Hollow Community Church, a modest place of worship nestled in a sleepy Texas town where everyone knew everyone. Pastor Charles was always there, at first with encouraging words, then with private counseling sessions. But once that line was crossed, it became easier to cross again. Teresa was a vibrant woman in her early 40s who still had a sharp mind and a wounded heart. She came to Charles for help rekindling her marriage. Instead, he helped her forget it. Their meetings were held in the parsonage late at night, under the excuse of late study groups or spiritual mentorship. Charles liked the excitement, the secrecy. With each new affair, his sense of invincibility grew stronger. Angela had grown suspicious when Charles began rescheduling their meetings more frequently, often with vague excuses. She noticed changes in his tone, in his affection. Teresa, sharp and intuitive, once found a strand of Deborah's long auburn hair on his sweater and said nothing but started watching more closely. It was the feeling of being needed in a way that no sermon or prayer could provide. These women looked at him with desperation, hunger, love, and fear. He thought he could outpreach, outtalk, and outmaneuver anything. He still walked proudly into his church every Sunday, Bible in hand, smile on his face, sermons ready to go. He thought he was the shepherd, guiding his flock with love and truth. He liked it. He didn't want to let go of any of them, even though deep down he sensed the edge of the cliff approaching. Deborah, deeply insecure, had begun asking questions whether Charles really cared, whether he ever felt guilty. Charles was no longer in control of the emotions he had stirred. They were beginning to bubble over. Her tears became gratitude, and that gratitude turned into something more dangerous. They met secretly in hotel rooms out of town. He was a man of God, after all, charming, respected, adored. The town saw it as growth. Charles saw it as legacy. His wife, Linda, thought he was working harder than ever for the glory of God. In truth, he was spinning a web so complex that even he had lost track of which lie went where. No one would believe these women over him. No one would dare question his integrity. His church attendance remained strong, the donations kept coming, and people still lined up to shake his hand every Sunday after service. Her struggle with depression had worsened after her second miscarriage. Her husband, Greg, loved her but didn't understand the depth of her pain. She started seeing Pastor Charles after a sermon on grief brought her to tears. The women began pushing for more time, more honesty, more promises. And the husbands, though still unaware of each other, had started noticing changes. Marvin noticed his wife checking her phone late at night. Darren saw Teresa smiling at texts she quickly deleted. Greg began reading his wife's journal and saw the initials "SO" circled in hearts. The puzzle pieces were drifting toward one another, and when they met, the picture would be much darker than anyone expected. He offered her warmth when she felt cold inside, and reassurance when her own husband seemed distant. Charles told her that she was special, that God had a plan for her, and that he, Charles, was part of it. What started as comfort turned into physical intimacy, masked by prayer and false promises. His sermons brought people to tears, his charity work earned him respect, and his leadership seemed to guide not only the spiritual path of his congregation, but the town's sense of morality itself. Charles was careful, methodical even. He used a separate prepaid phone for each woman. He believed he was untouchable, protected by the robe of leadership and the silence of his lovers. Angela grew bolder, Teresa grew more attached, and Deborah became emotionally dependent. Charles enjoyed the power it gave him, the ability to control how people felt, to mold their needs around his desires. He deleted messages, rotated locations, and kept his personal routine as consistent as ever, so Linda never suspected anything. He even went as far as counseling the very husbands whose wives he was seducing. Marvin came to him for advice on rebuilding trust. Darren asked for prayer about his wife's emotional distance. Greg confided in him about his fears that Deborah was slipping further into despair. Charles would nod, pray with them, and then leave to meet their wives behind closed doors. He was married to Linda Hemsworth, a quiet and graceful woman who stood by his side through every Sunday service and community dinner. They had no children, but people often said their bond was a shining example of love built on faith. When these three men uncovered the truth, justice wasn't left to the courts. What followed was a brutal confrontation in a lonely Texas field where faith turned to fury and a pastor's sins were repaid with blood. Pastor Charles Hemsworth was the kind of man people trusted without question. But what most didn't know was that Pastor Charles had grown restless. Somewhere between the endless sermons, charity events, and marital routines, something in him shifted. He felt disconnected, like he was just going through the motions, offering hope to others while feeling none of it himself. His need for attention, for connection beyond what was considered holy, began to rise quietly, like smoke from a fire no one had noticed yet. Angela Monroe was the first. She had started coming to the church alone after her husband Marvin lost his job and turned to alcohol and gambling. Angela needed someone to listen. Charles told himself he was helping her feel loved. He convinced himself it was a special connection that somehow existed outside the rules of the world he preached about. Teresa Mills was next. Her marriage to Darren had grown stale, full of silence and obligation. Deborah Collins was different. She was quieter, softer, and more fragile. None of the three women knew about the others. Months passed. Charles juggled this triple life with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. But beneath the surface, cracks had started to form. Still, Charles refused to stop. He believed he could manage it. He was even planning an expansion of the church building, a new wing for youth counseling, a coffee shop in the lobby, and a studio for broadcasting his sermons online. It wasn't just lust or loneliness that drove him anymore. By the end of that summer, things had become strained. But Pastor Charles didn't see it. He didn't know that the wolves were already inside the pen. The first thread of the pastor's secret life began to unravel in the smallest of ways. Teresa Mills had come by the church office one weekday afternoon to drop off a casserole for the volunteer luncheon. The late-night texts, the last-minute changes in their meetings, the half-hearted excuses. It all seemed so clear now. She didn't confront him. She was taking long walks alone, locking her phone, avoiding eye contact. There were no names, just that initial. But the nature of the conversations was clear. Someone had been offering her more than spiritual comfort. Someone had been meeting her in person. He wasn't ready. He needed to know for sure. He started watching her quietly, noting when she left, where she went, who she talked to. He even followed her one evening in his truck, trailing from a distance as she drove out of town. Angela was distant, always checking her phone, dressing differently. She claimed she was involved in new prayer groups and spiritual workshops, but she was vague on details. Marvin, still dealing with job loss and self-doubt, had been too consumed by his own failures to question it. He didn't say much, just that he believed someone close to both of them was being unfaithful with their wives, and that he had reason to believe it was Pastor Charles. At first, Marvin thought it was a sick joke. But when the second message came with details only someone in the same situation would know, he responded. But then, one evening, Angela came home wearing perfume she never used and carrying a Bible with someone else's handwriting in the margins. Still, they needed to be sure it wasn't just the two of them. They didn't trust the police to handle it, and they didn't want their own reputations dragged into a public scandal. Each of them felt like a fool. Each of them wanted some kind of justice. Their plan wasn't final yet, but the fire had already started. He had noticed Teresa's coldness, but he had assumed it was his fault. But once Greg and Marvin reached out to him directly and shared what they knew, he began checking her call logs and matching her calendar to Charles's movements. It all aligned. A week later, Greg posted anonymously on a local church forum, asking if anyone else had suspicions about the pastor. Teresa's husband, Darren Mills, replied. When Marvin asked about it, she shrugged it off, said she had borrowed it from a church friend. That answer lingered in his mind like smoke. When she pulled into the back parking lot of an abandoned motel, Greg parked 2 streets away and waited. 30 minutes later, another car pulled up. They sat together under the wooden beams, passing around printed photos, text messages, and timelines. None of them needed to say it outright. They were united by betrayal and shame. He didn't see the driver's face clearly, but he knew the car. It belonged to Pastor Charles. And as Greg looked closer at the timing of the texts late at night, during Deborah's prayer sessions, he started forming a terrifying picture. A man he had trusted, confided in, prayed with, had been betraying him in the worst possible way. But even then, Greg didn't react with fury. It was a remote field on the edge of town. When he checked the history, he found several searches for that same spot. Angela had never mentioned going there. That was enough for him to start asking around. He began watching the pastor too, curious to see if Angela's schedule matched Charles's. One day it did. Marvin sat in his car outside the field marked on the map, camera phone ready, and watched Charles's car pull in. 30 minutes later, Angela's car followed. He took photos from a distance, blurry but unmistakable. Not yet. He sat in the truck, numb, staring at the motel sign flickering in the dark. The betrayal was so deep it stunned him into silence. One evening, while she was in the shower, Greg picked up her phone, not to spy, but out of instinct. A message preview flashed on the screen. "You are the light in my darkest moments." See? His heart pounded. Deborah rarely received such messages, and never from someone signed with just a letter. He knew it wasn't a friend or relative. The language was too intimate. Instead, she started watching him, paying closer attention to how he moved, how he spoke to others, what time he left and arrived. She took notes without even realizing it. Every inconsistency became a red flag. Every unexplained pause became a warning. Still, she wasn't ready to face the truth, not yet. There was a small chance she was wrong, and she needed proof before her heart accepted what her mind already suspected. Charles wasn't there, but the office was unlocked, as it often was during the day. She left the dish in the break room, but on her way out, she noticed the corner of his desk drawer was slightly ajar. Inside was a pair of gold hoop earrings, small, delicate, not her style. She hadn't worn earrings in weeks, and certainly not those. A chill ran through her. She closed the drawer without touching anything and walked out of the office like nothing had happened, but 1,000 thoughts now swirled inside her. At home, Teresa replayed every recent moment with Charles. Meanwhile, across town, Greg Collins had his own reasons for sleepless nights. Deborah had been pulling away again. He scrolled quickly through her recent texts, heart sinking lower with every word. Greg didn't speak to Deborah about it. The truth slammed into Greg like a hammer. Around the same time, Marvin Monroe had begun piecing together his own puzzle. A week later, Marvin went into their shared laptop to apply for a job and noticed an open tab with a Google Maps location saved. 3 men, 3 separate investigations, all circling the same man. Greg was the one who made the first move. He created a fake email and reached out anonymously to Marvin. They started exchanging information. Marvin shared the photos. Greg sent the motel address and times. They both came to the same horrifying conclusion. Darren didn't know what to think at first. The 3 men arranged to meet in person. They picked an old barn outside of town, long abandoned, hidden behind rows of dead trees. What started as a discovery had become a fire. The shepherd they once followed had become something else entirely, and they weren't going to let him walk away untouched. The tension between the 3 men had reached a breaking point. What started as quiet suspicion had become a dangerous alliance, held together by rage and humiliation. Greg Collins, Marvin Monroe, and Darren Mills had been strangers just weeks ago, but now they were bound by a shared betrayal. Each had discovered that Pastor Charles Hemsworth had seduced their wives, lied to their faces, and used his position of trust as a weapon. They didn't talk about guilt or forgiveness. They didn't speak about right or wrong. They only focused on what needed to happen next. There were no stars, just a heavy sky and the low hum of distant insects. He was alone, stepping out of his sedan in a clean white shirt, holding his phone and looking around as if waiting for someone. He didn't see them at first. The 3 men moved quickly, surrounding him from the shadows. He didn't scream. He didn't fight. At first, he tried to reason with them, calm, composed, as if he could pray the situation away. That's when Greg lost control. He shoved Charles hard, sending him stumbling back into the dirt. Kicks, punches, yells. It wasn't planned anymore. It wasn't about a confession or exposure. It had turned into something else, a violent release of every emotion they had buried. His chest wasn't rising. Marvin dropped to his knees, breathing hard, his knuckles swollen and torn. Darren knelt beside Charles and checked for a pulse. But now the pastor was dead, his white shirt soaked red, his body broken in the dirt where he once stood so proudly. The three men stood frozen, unable to speak. He didn't speak, but his expression said everything. It wasn't well hidden, but they didn't have time to be careful. They wiped down Charles's car and left the scene one by one, heading in separate directions. None of them spoke again that night. None of them called the police. The betrayal, the humiliation, the sleepless nights, they poured it all into him. Charles scrambled to get up, but Marvin kicked him in the ribs, knocking the air out of him. Marvin sat at his kitchen table in silence, holding a beer he never drank. Darren went back to work like nothing had happened, but he didn't say a word to anyone that day. The crowbar never made contact. Marvin dropped it as his hands curled into fists. A jogger had found the body before sunrise, and within hours the area was swarming with police and reporters. Oak Hollow hadn't seen a murder in years, let alone one involving the most beloved figure in town. Darren stepped in next, striking Charles across the jaw, his face twisted in fury. The man they had trusted, the one who had preached about sin and purity, now lay writhing in the grass. Pastor Charles Hemsworth was dead. The truth was buried with him for now, but secrets like these never stay hidden forever. Each man arrived separately, parking their trucks along the edge of the overgrown road. Greg brought a flashlight and a small handheld camcorder ready to record the confrontation. Marvin carried a crowbar hidden in the bed of his truck. He claimed it was for intimidation, nothing more. Darren wore leather gloves and kept to himself, eyes fixed on the tree line. They met again at the old barn, this time with more intent. Greg brought a printed map and highlighted the locations where Charles met the women. It was about forcing the truth out of Charles and destroying the mask he wore so confidently. Marvin stepped forward, holding the crowbar tight, pressing it against Charles's shoulder, not striking him, but showing he wasn't afraid to escalate. Darren said nothing. He just stood in front of Charles, watching his every move, searching for any sign of remorse. There was none. They wanted to record a confession, expose him publicly, and make him feel the pain they had carried. Greg suggested confronting him in private, somewhere far from the church, where he couldn't twist the narrative. Marvin proposed using one of the secluded spots Charles visited for his meetings. Darren agreed, but warned them not to underestimate him. Charles had built a life on lies. He would lie again if cornered. Marvin brought printed phone records showing the exact times Angela had been at those same places. Darren, the most reserved of the three, simply listened. But when he finally spoke, his words were cold and direct. They needed to confront Charles. It had gone too far. They started planning. Not with guns or knives. This wasn't about murder, they told themselves. They chose the field just outside Oak Hollow, quiet, isolated, surrounded by thick brush and forgotten roads. Charles often used the place to meet Deborah and Angela when they couldn't risk being seen. It was the perfect location. The men staked it out twice, learning his patterns. They noted what time he usually arrived, how long he stayed, and which route he took to get there. They even tested the cell service to make sure no one could accidentally call for help or track them easily. The night they chose was unseasonably warm. Charles arrived just before 9 p.m., but the men weren't there for words. Greg shouted first, demanding to know how long it had been going on. Charles backed away, trying to deny it. Charles tried to turn it around, claiming their wives had come to him, that he had only provided support. Charles tried to crawl away, but the blows kept coming. At some point, Charles stopped moving. The silence was deafening. Greg stepped back first, his hands shaking. Blood covered Charles's face. His eyes were closed. Panic set in. They hadn't meant to kill him. They had only wanted him to suffer, to admit what he had done. They dragged the body to a nearby ditch, covering it with branches and brush. By morning, the town was buzzing. Greg watched the news alone in his living room, eyes fixed on the screen. None of them knew what would happen next, but they all felt the weight of what they'd done. The discovery of Pastor Charles Hemsworth's body shook Oak Hollow to its core. News of the murder spread like wildfire, crossing every fence and reaching every porch in town before the police could even issue a formal statement. By noon, the church was surrounded by reporters, shocked parishioners, and curious bystanders. The man who had once stood at the center of the community was now the center of a homicide investigation. The details were sparse. At first, his body had been found in a field outside town, badly beaten and abandoned under a pile of brush. He worked late nights alone, took unexplained phone calls, and began counseling sessions that weren't logged on the church calendar. The resolution was poor, but the timestamps aligned with days Charles claimed he was alone in prayer. Angela admitted she had been seeing Charles for nearly 8 months. Teresa said it had been close to a year. Deborah cried as she admitted to emotional dependency that turned physical not long before his death. Each man had different stories, but they all had one thing in common: they were deeply hurt. All three had been within a mile of the crime scene on the night Charles was killed. All three had phone activity that stopped for nearly the same 2-hour window. Marvin confessed first. He said it wasn't supposed to happen that way. They just wanted to scare Charles, make him admit what he'd done. Others condemned them for taking justice into their own hands. Many were angry that Charles's double life had tainted the church's image and shaken their belief in the people they once trusted most. Some say she moved up north to be closer to family. Others say she simply wanted to be where no one knew her name or her husband's sins. A collapse of trust, marriage, morality, and community. The story of Pastor Charles Hemsworth would be remembered not for his sermons, but for the lies he told in whispers and the brutal way they caught up to him. No one who had touched that story came out clean. Everyone carried a scar, even those who never set foot in that field. Greg admitted to recording the event on a camcorder, though the footage had been destroyed after the killing. Each faced judgment from the community and estrangement from friends and family. Angela moved to Houston. Teresa filed for divorce and went to live with her sister in Oklahoma. Deborah, overwhelmed by guilt, checked herself into a mental health facility and remained there for several months. Darren was the last to speak, but when he did, he said the others took it too far and he couldn't stop them. And when detectives examined security footage from a nearby gas station, they saw Greg Collins purchasing gas and gloves just an hour before the murder occurred. Nature crept in through cracked foundations and broken doors. The place once filled with hymns and handshakes became a monument to silence, betrayal, and violence. The men were charged with manslaughter, conspiracy, and obstruction. Each accepted a plea deal to avoid trial, receiving 15-year sentences with the possibility of parole. Marvin Monroe claimed he and Angela had been going through a rough patch, but he'd had no proof of infidelity. Darren Mills said he and Teresa had grown distant, though he admitted she had recently started keeping her phone locked. Greg Collins, however, gave investigators pause. He said very little, kept his answers vague, and didn't offer an alibi for the night of the murder. Something about his posture and tone struck Marston as off, not grieving, not shocked, just hollow. Each woman confessed they believed they were the only one. Detective Marston pulled church phone records and began tracing calls from the pastor's office to 3 different numbers. All belonged to women in the congregation: Angela Monroe, Teresa Mills, and Deborah Collins. A few had their suspicions about his behavior, but never imagined anything so severe. No witnesses, no suspects. Just silence and blood. Detective Linda Marston led the investigation. She was methodical, sharp, and not easily swayed by public opinion. His ribs were broken, jaw fractured, and skull partially crushed. No defensive wounds. That told detectives one important thing: he didn't fight back. Whether he was caught off guard or overwhelmed didn't matter. What mattered was that he was outnumbered. She didn't care how loved or respected Pastor Charles had been. She focused only on facts. The crime scene offered little in terms of direct evidence. No murder weapon was recovered, but signs of a struggle were obvious. Multiple boot prints circled the body, different sizes, different depths. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was personal, chaotic, and full of rage. Autopsy reports confirmed what the scene suggested: Charles had suffered blunt force trauma from multiple angles. As police dug into Charles's personal life, the cracks beneath his polished surface became visible. At first, they interviewed his wife, Linda Hemsworth. She appeared calm but clearly in shock. She insisted that her husband had no enemies, no threats, no troubles outside the occasional pressure of church responsibilities. She spoke about their marriage with fondness, but couldn't remember the last time they'd been truly close. That detail stuck with Detective Marston. Next came the church staff. Several members mentioned that Charles had recently become more secretive. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Surveillance footage from a side office hallway showed Charles walking into the church late at night with women who were not his wife. All three women were brought in for questioning separately. Each broke under pressure, not from fear of the law but from the weight of guilt they had been carrying. That revelation confirmed what Marston already suspected. Charles Hemsworth had been living a double life, and his secrets had caught up with him. The next logical step was to speak to the husbands. They obtained a warrant for phone records and GPS data from all three men. Within days, the pieces began falling into place. None of the men had criminal records. None had a history of violence. But the digital trail didn't lie. They were arrested one by one, each brought in for separate interrogations. Prosecutors decided not to pursue first-degree murder charges. The evidence showed intent to confront, not necessarily to kill. The town reacted with disbelief and division. Some people defended the men, calling them broken husbands who were pushed beyond their limits. Angela, Teresa, and Deborah left Oak Hollow shortly after the trial. Linda Hemsworth disappeared from public life. She sold the house, closed her social media accounts, and declined all interviews. The Oak Hollow Community Church never reopened. It was left abandoned, its stained glass windows collecting dust and dirt, its pews empty and silent. Detective Marston closed the case but admitted it haunted her. It wasn't just a murder, it was a collapse. What began as quiet affairs under the veil of faith ended in a storm that tore apart families, friendships, and faith itself. The years that followed Pastor Charles Hemsworth's death left a permanent scar on the town of Oak Hollow. Time moved forward as it always does, but for the people closest to the tragedy. Life didn't just continue, it changed direction entirely. Angela Monroe tried to rebuild in Houston. She found a job as a receptionist in a dental clinic and kept to herself. The shame of what happened never left her. Her divorce from Marvin was quiet but final. He never answered her letters and she didn't blame him. She opened a small nail salon and went by her maiden name to avoid unwanted attention. None caused trouble, and none spoke much about the night that brought them there. Marvin read the Bible daily and eventually joined a prison ministry group. Greg worked in the prison library and avoided social interaction as much as possible. She never spoke publicly about her husband's affairs or the murder trial. The Hemsworth case was the last major investigation of her career. In her retirement speech, she didn't mention it directly, but she spoke about the cost of buried truths and the danger of appearances. It was the kind of speech that left the room quiet long after the applause ended. To those who knew her, she seemed like a ghost, kind, polite, but absent in spirit. Parents used it as a cautionary tale for their children. "Be careful who you trust," they'd say. "Even good men have shadows." The story passed into local folklore: how a beloved pastor fell, how three broken men lost control, how lies and love spiraled into violence. True crime blogs covered it briefly. A documentary crew visited once, filming interviews with townspeople who were willing to talk. But eventually the story was replaced by newer headlines and fresher tragedies. The world moved on, as it always does. She never remarried. Occasionally, she donated to women's shelters and grief counseling centers under anonymous names. A stained legacy, a silence that echoed louder than any sermon. Some believed it was her way of coping, giving back to people whose pain mirrored her own. Others said she simply wanted to disappear. No one knew who. Some said it was Linda. Others thought it might be one of the women, or even a member of the congregation who still believed in the man he once appeared to be. Others said he was just a man who made terrible choices, no true justice, only ruins of what once was. But no one could deny that his actions had detonated something massive, an emotional explosion that tore through families, friendships, and faith itself. No one ever claimed responsibility. Darren kept to himself, taking up carpentry and spending most of his time in the workshop. The media had painted her as one of the women who broke the pastor. He returned to Oak Hollow briefly, staying with a cousin while he looked for work, but the town had changed. People stared. Whispers followed him. He left within a month and relocated to Corpus Christi, where he worked at a mechanic shop under a new name. Greg was released a year later and moved to Arizona to live with a distant uncle. Darren took the longest to get out. When he did, he refused all contact with reporters and declined to be part of any interviews. Each man lived with the knowledge that their actions, however fueled by betrayal and pain, had ended a life and forever marked their own. And though she knew that wasn't the full truth, she couldn't escape the label. Eventually, the building was sold to a real estate developer who planned to turn it into a community center, but the project never took off. Locals refused to support it. They said the building felt wrong, like it held a weight too heavy for any renovation to erase. The windows were boarded up. Weeds grew through cracks in the pavement. A place once filled with light now stood as a forgotten structure with no purpose. Her divorce from Darren was bitter. He never spoke to her again after the trial. Teresa later admitted to a friend that she sometimes replayed those nights with Charles in her mind, trying to understand what she had really felt: love, confusion, or just the thrill of being desired again. In the end, it didn't matter. The damage had already been done. She stopped attending church altogether, unable to walk into a place of worship without remembering the look on Charles' face the last time she saw him alive. Angela never tried to start over romantically. She lived alone in a small apartment with a view of a busy intersection, the sound of traffic replacing the sermons she once clung to. Teresa Mills moved in with her sister in Oklahoma City. Deborah Collins remained in Texas but disappeared from the public eye. After spending 6 months in a private facility for mental health treatment, she relocated to a small rural town under a different name. Her marriage to Greg was over. He never wrote to her from prison, and she never visited. Deborah never talked publicly about Charles or what he meant to her, but she kept a journal that she filled with letters addressed to him, letters that no one would ever read. She wrote not to forgive or to condemn, but to try to make sense of how a man who had seemed so kind, so godly, could have brought such destruction into her life. Greg Collins, Marvin Monroe, and Darren Mills served their time in separate correctional facilities across the state. All three were model inmates. Their parole hearings came around the same time. Marvin was the first to be released. The Oak Hollow Community Church remained closed for 5 years after the murder. Linda Hemsworth, Charles's widow, moved to Colorado, where she lived with her brother. Detective Linda Marston remained with the Oak Hollow Police Department until her retirement 3 years after the case closed. In the broader public memory, the story of Pastor Charles Hemsworth faded, yet in Oak Hollow the memory never really left. Each year, on the anniversary of Charles's death, someone placed a single white lily on the steps of the old church building. The tragedy became a quiet legend. No one ever truly understood how Charles had managed to keep so many secrets, how he had juggled so many lives. Some said he was a predator. In the end, there were no heroes. A shattered church.